The Kalam Cosmological Argument is simply demonstrating the non-regression of those things which we refer to as hawadith. Hawadith are anything that comes into existence after non-existence, anything which has an accidental nature. You cannot have a continuous regress of anything which is contingent by nature.
Right.
So you reach a point where the cause of everything contingent must be self-sufficient.
So the cause of everything in the universe is contingent. It's not necessary. It's not eternal, because everything that came to be must have a cause. Is that right? Everything came into existence.
By its very nature, by observation,
right.
Everything in the universe is contingent, accidental.
Right.
It came into existence. They attempt to counter this argument by saying you only observe an aspect of the universe. How do you know the rest of the universe is not eternal? Which is absurd, because I mentioned in the book also, in order to simplify this, the universe is either still or moving, and both of these are the very nature of contingent things, to be still or to move. Something eternal is not described as being moving or being still at the same time, or paradoxically both at the same time. It cannot be moving, it cannot be still, because stillness and movement is the very nature of contingent things, those things which are contained by a void or time and direction and spatial location. Anything which is in spatial location, contained by 6 directions,
right.
It cannot be eternal.
Now, but why can't it be eternal? Why can't you have an infinite regress? So you have one contingent thing caused by another contingent thing caused by another infinite contingent thing ad infinitum. But you've said that's not possible. So why is an infinite regress, as it's sometimes called, not coherent? Why is it logically impossible in your view? Because you could just have an eternal universe without a cause, an ultimate cause, perhaps.
Because essentially anything which is contingent in nature would have to go out of existence.
Right.
And that which sustains those things which go out of existence needs to have self-sufficiency. If it's not self-sufficient, then those things that it produces will go out of existence, and the sustainability is totally impossible.
Right.
To sustain such a continuous chain would be totally impossible. And that's what the Kalam Cosmological Argument demonstrates, that the continuation of... So Craig, he gives examples of an eternal library, that he gives a mental
thought experiments.
And he demonstrates through thought experiments that it's impossible to have it. You can reframe or restructure this argument in many ways. So I've given the 7 principles. If you remember in the chapter, in the 3rd chapter,
in the book,
there is the 7 principles that something eternal cannot have a contingent nature by essence, because everything has something additional to itself. So you can never conceive of something without an attribute. So if I told you to conceive mentally something without an attribute, you cannot. So if you thought of, let's say, a hollow circle, the hollow circle still has an attribute of being a circle, of being hollow. Similarly, a rock with no attribute, it still will have an attribute. So everything has something additional to itself which is contingent and accidental. Now, if it has something additional to itself, that additional thing is contingent by nature, if you think of it like this. And then that contingent nature is non-transferable. So you cannot say the circleness of a circle will transfer itself to a square and make the square a circle. So it's non-transferable. And therefore it's essential to that thing. And being essential to that thing would entail, and by the way, they refer to this, the atheists, when I debate them, they refer to this as mental gymnastics. So they say all this mental gymnastics is unnecessary. So if we avoid all this mental gymnastics, they say by default, my position is what is skepticism. By default, the claim is that the counterclaim to all of these arguments is that the default state of someone is skepticism. So skepticism is the natural state. This is what they claim.
Which is odd, because it's not obvious to me that skepticism is the default natural state. Why should skepticism be that? You mentioned the fitra, the natural state is the disposition to believe in God and transcendence and so on.
All ancient civilizations, Amazonian people and others, they all demonstrate that the natural state of man is to believe in a transcendent God, if they like using the word God.
There was a survey done recently at Oxford, I seem to remember, where the researchers looked at a whole range of different contemporary cultures, including very secular cultures like Japan and South Korea and so on. And they found that children, very young children everywhere, had this instinctive belief regardless of how they were brought up, whether brought up in a secular home or a religious home, they all witness to this belief. So this seems to be empirical evidence that is actually an innate disposition and not instilled in children by the society or their upbringing or their parents. It's not. It's just part of the DNA, if you like. I don't mean literally DNA, I don't know, but the metaphorical DNA of our species. We are believing creatures, as you say.
So what they attempt to do now is, by dismissing these arguments, what they do is they dismiss all these arguments and they go on to the default position, which is skepticism is the default position, and you need to demonstrate to me that God exists. Now the problem with this is that it's subjective, because you will meet atheists. If you say to them, if God wrote in the sky that God exists through stars for you, would you believe? They say no, it could be a figment of my imagination. So now convincing a specific individual is subjective to that individual. It's a denial of objective truth. What in Islamic Kalam they refer to as nafsul amr, real objective reality, meaning that which exists. So claiming skepticism is the natural default step, default state, is a way of avoiding the entire argument. So you can present all these arguments, and the counterattack will be incapable of rendering those arguments as faulty, but at the same time they will say, I'm a skeptic, you need to present one evidence that will convince me.
I often find that atheists are very skeptical, are very selective in their epistemological skepticism. So they'll direct their skepticism towards God on this question, but on other fundamental a priori beliefs, beliefs we had prior to experiencing reality, like even the existence of the world, for example, or the existence of other minds, independent of our own minds, they're not skeptical. They just take this as given, even though it's very difficult to prove that the external world exists other than just pointing at it, because it could be an illusion. It might just be a product of our own minds. How do you prove that it exists separate from just pointing at it? And if they were to employ this skepticism to other cognitive faculties they have and other epistemologies, they wouldn't be able to do science. They wouldn't be able to go about their daily lives. So I think their skepticism is very selective and focused on one particular thing, but in other areas they just trust that reality is that it is. They trust that the universe is ordered. They trust that other minds exist. They trust.
What they do is ad hoc.
Exactly.
They redesign their arguments every time they encounter something that can violate their preconceptions. So for instance, if you remember when I mentioned the underlying materialistic philosophies that underlie new atheism, so there was utilitarianism, it's there, but the new atheist wouldn't know where to start with utilitarianism, where it begins and where it ends, selectively choosing different aspects of a philosophy. So we as Muslims would be described as realists. We believe in haqa'iqul ashya. So the Muslim theologians say haqa'iqul ashya'i thabitatun, the realities of things are established. So we don't fall into the Greek the Greek skeptics, the various schools that they had. They had so many different schools that some of them denied reality, material reality.
Well, that's where it came from, the ancient Greeks. It's not all of them, of course. I don't think Plato was a skeptic, but there were skeptic philosophers there. And in the West, I think that's where the virus, if you like, began, in ancient Greek philosophy 2,500 years ago. And passed down to David Hume, who I'm going to quote in a minute, actually. And so, this is it's a peculiarly Western virus, I think, that goes back to the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
Very strange.
That school, the ancient Greek school, is covered in classical Islamic theology, where they refute all these various Greek philosophers and the types of schools. I've listed those types of schools in chapter 3.